And so there's this importance of information, of knowledge, and disseminating that, like today. There are great parallels of then and now. And so I really want to take a moment for us to be in this space and to understand how important Black lives, Black bodies are then and now. And even as we talk about eviction moratoriums, because it's really affecting so many Black communities in the East Bay. So if we can take a moment to honor that space, just a few moments, and just maybe 30 seconds to be in that moment. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, let's ease into the conversation. Thank you again for joining. I'm gonna pass it over to Alex Worth, Policy Associate, who's gonna give us some information, tell us what is going on with eviction moratoriums.
Thank you so much, Kiki. Good morning, everybody. I'm so grateful, so humbled to be with you today. In honor of Juneteenth, in our collective effort to share information, share the information that we need so that our communities, our families can live with dignity, can get free. So Kiki, thank you so much for that grounding. I'm really humbled and honored to be able to be with you all and to try to share what I know and be of service on this really momentous day. So let's hope that we're blessed with good technical logistics and communication today. Kiki, do you want to try to share the slideshow that I'm going to be referring to? Okay, that looks great. Thank you. So again, Kiki, thank you for the introduction. My name is Alex Worth. I serve as the Policy Associate at East Bay Housing Organizations. You've got my email address there. I'm going to be sharing it multiple times throughout the course of this presentation because I can't really stress enough how important it is to just be in touch. We all really need to be able to support each other right now, and I want to be here as a supporter to EBHO's membership, to folks who work with us, who walk alongside us, as well as really just anybody else in the community who needs information. I also want to be really clear about who I am not. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree, and I'm not a tenant counselor. I'm a researcher. I'm someone who works on policy, and I'm an advocate. And to be quite honest, I have been on a learning journey of my own in the time of COVID about how evictions work and what sorts of policies are needed in order to protect renters from evictions. So what I'm sharing with you today is not something that I have, been living for a long time or working on for a long time. I'm in the learning journey myself. So I want to just submit that to you and to just be honest about where I'm at. And also to say that, the best thing you can do if you're really in a position where you're really concerned about eviction is to get real legal help from a tenant attorney or a tenant counselor. And we're going to be sharing legal resources with you in later slides, perhaps in the chat, and also immediately after this webinar in a follow-up email. Okay, Kiki, next slide, please. So I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to break up what I share with you into 3 sections. The first section is kind of at a general level, learning about evictions and eviction moratoriums or moratoria. You might hear me use the plural term moratoria. So we're going to talk about what is an eviction moratorium, how does it work, and what sorts of policies are in place right now, and how do those impact evictions in the current moment. The second section, we're going to drill down on the policies that exist in Contra Costa County. And in the third section, we're going to drill down on the policies that exist in Alameda County. And I want to say that we're going to take a pause for questions in between each one of these sections. And, you know, one thing I want to say from the outset is that with so many different cities and counties passing their own policies, there is a lot of variation from place to place. And so the information that may be helpful to one person who lives, say, in Albany may be very different than the information that's needed from somebody else who lives in Pittsburgh. So I'm going to try to give you as much information that will be relevant to you regardless of where you're living. But in that Q&A, if we want to get into more specifics based on where you live and the issues that you're facing, then there'll be time for that. And I also want to flag that I'm also going to discuss with you opportunities for how to take action in service of tenant protections at the end of sections 2 and sections 3. Next slide, please. So let's start first off at a really basic level. What is an eviction moratorium? Well, an eviction is the process of expelling a tenant from a property. And a moratorium is a temporary prohibition on an activity. So if we put these two things together, then we can say that an eviction moratorium is a temporary ban on activities that cause a tenant to be removed from a space that they rent. And I want to stress that these activities can be either direct or indirect. What I mean by that is that you know, a direct activity that leads to eviction might be something like a landlord serving a tenant with an eviction notice, which requires them to leave the unit, or when the sheriff's department executes a court order to physically remove someone from their home. So that's a direct form of eviction. And a moratorium, in order to be effective, needs to stop those direct forms of removal. But there's also indirect activities that can lead to eviction as well. So for instance, a landlord might raise the rent on a tenant, knowing that they're going to be unable to pay that increased rent, and therefore the landlord will be able to evict the tenant because they're unable to pay that increased amount. So that rent increase, we could say, would be an indirect activity that would lead to eviction. So again, in order to be a true moratorium, then a policy needs to halt both the direct and the indirect activities that could cause a tenant to lose their housing. And I want to say one other thing before we go any further, which is that the housing system is in crisis right now. And today we're going to talk mainly about how that crisis impacts tenants, but I do want to recognize that it impacts businesses, it impacts homeowners, and it impacts unhoused people as well. And there are different sorts of policies that address the experiences of people in different groups. So for like small businesses, for instance, there are moratoriums on commercial evictions that are very similar to what we're going to discuss today, but it has to do with commercial tenants rather than residential tenants. For homeowners, there are policies called foreclosure moratorias. They basically put a pause on the foreclosure process, which might lead to a homeowner losing their property. And for unhoused people, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has issued guidelines encouraging local governments not to close encampments or remove people's belongings. And these are guidelines that the city of Oakland, for instance, has adopted. Again, we're not going to focus on the specifics of these issues in this webinar. We're really going to drill down on the issues impacting residential renters in particular. But if you do have questions about some of those other groups, I'll do my best to answer them in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is an eviction moratorium needed right now? Why have we seen governments all across the country passing these policies due to COVID? Well, as we all know, the government has taken many different public health measures in order to slow the spread of COVID-19. And those measures tend to be very restrictive, and they've made it harder for renters to, except with the exception of essential workers, to go out, to work safely, to earn an income, and pay for their household expenses and pay their rent. Under normal circumstances, as a renter, if you don't pay your rent, then you can be evicted. So what this means in the context of the coronavirus pandemic is that there are millions of renters who have seen a significant loss of household income who are now at risk of eviction through no fault of their own, right? This is not because anybody made a mistake or behaved badly in any way like that. It's just that the public health crisis and the measures taken in order to combat it have made it virtually impossible for up to millions of renters to pay their rent. And the key thing I want to stress here is that this situation has been in part created through governmental action. And I don't mean to condemn those public health policies at all. I think that they have been completely necessary in order to try to stem community spread of the coronavirus. But the point here is that if the government has kind of created the situation, then the government also has a responsibility to make sure that tenants aren't evicted as a result. And the consequences of not having an eviction moratorium are very problematic. First, without eviction moratoria, low to moderate income renters could lose their housing en masse. And that this would very likely add to the homelessness crisis, which is already really unacceptable in California. And it would also make it much harder for people who lose housing to shelter in place or self-isolate in order to protect their own health as well as protect the public health. And especially in light of the fact that it's Juneteenth, but honestly, really every single day of the year, we need to be honest about the fact that this is a matter of racial and economic justice as well. And what I mean by that is that, due to the legacies of structural racism in this country, including things like residential segregation and economic inequality, Black and brown renters are much more likely than white ones to experience unemployment, housing insecurity, and be at risk of eviction right now. So if we as a community, as a society, don't do anything in order to protect renters against evictions, then the impacts of that, which can be really detrimental and really traumatic, will fall overwhelmingly and unjustly on Black and brown people in particular. Next slide, please. So a question that we get a lot is, okay, but what about property owners? I'm sympathetic to renters, but what about property owners? And this is a very reasonable question in my opinion, because if tenants are unable to pay their rent, then property owners lose their source of income, and it means that they may not be able to pay their mortgages, they may not be able to pay their taxes, and they may not be able to pay for maintenance costs. And that could lead to things like foreclosure, for instance. And I want to be really clear that as an organization, EBHO is advocating for financial relief so that tenants don't end up in debt, and so that landlords, especially small property owners and nonprofit affordable housing providers, can stay afloat and keep our communities affordable. And the reason that we call out small property owners and nonprofit affordable housing providers in particular is because, as I like to say, not all property owners are created equally. And what I mean by that is that some property owners make a lot more money than other property owners. And that profit provides them with a certain degree of financial buffer should they see a drop in income because tenants are unable to pay their rent. So when it comes to large real estate investment trusts and corporate landlords, they have massive, oftentimes multi-billion-dollar portfolios of rental housing. And if some of their tenants are unable to pay their rent, then they may see a little bit less profit across their portfolio, but they're not going to go out of business as a result of that. On the flip side, you have small property owners who maybe own one or two small apartments, oftentimes in working class neighborhoods. And you have mission-driven affordable housing providers who aren't in it to make a profit at all. And their ability to withstand the economic shock of tenants not being able to pay their rent en masse is much, much more precarious. So we think that financial relief really needs to be directed to small property owners and affordable housing providers so that they can forgive the debt of their tenants while still remain afloat. So that said, again, we are going to focus on the experiences of tenants and the tenant protections that are needed to avoid mass homelessness and displacement right now, because those things would make the pandemic much, much worse. Next slide, please. Okay, so in order to understand how an eviction moratorium works, we want to understand how an eviction works. And again, this is a complicated process. So in California, the eviction process proceeds in 5 steps. The first step is that the landlord gives the tenant an eviction notice, which basically tells the tenant that they need to vacate the unit by a specific date. The next step is that if the tenant doesn't vacate by that date, then the landlord can initiate an eviction lawsuit. I want to make sure that people can hear me. Can you nod, please? Yes, okay, I got muted for a second. Thank you. So the landlord can then initiate an eviction lawsuit, which is technically called an unlawful detainer. So you may hear me refer to unlawful detainers or UDs. The third step is that unlawful detainer suit actually goes to court, and the court holds a hearing or a series of hearings to receive evidence and legal arguments that will be used in order to decide the case. Fourth, the court issues a ruling. And if the court issues a ruling to evict the tenant, then it will issue a judgment that directs the tenant to vacate the unit and often to pay monetary obligations like unpaid rent to the landlord. The court will also issue an order that tells the local sheriff to physically remove the tenant. So then fifth and finally, the sheriff will execute the order, which is called a writ of possession, to remove the tenant by conducting the physical eviction. And again, the goal of a moratorium is to prevent people from being removed from housing. So in order for a moratorium to be truly effective, then it needs to halt each one of these 5 steps in the process. Next slide, please. So who regulates each one of these activities? This is part of the complexity. Each stage tends to be regulated by different levels of government, which you can see here. So when it comes to advocating for tenant protections and advocating for a true eviction moratorium in the time of COVID, it's complicated because we need protections that are targeted to each stage of the eviction process and therefore different levels of government and different agencies of government. Next slide, please. So the question is there a true moratorium in the East Bay? And what I want to say is that the short answer is yes, but only for now. So you can see here that the first stage in the process, the eviction notice, is effectively prohibited in almost all cases right now through city and county ordinances. And we're going to spend most of this webinar talking about those city and county ordinances in particular. When it comes to steps 2, 3, and 4, which really have to do with the court case, or the unlawful detainer case, those are also put on pause right now. And the reason for that is that there is a somewhat obscure organization called the California Judicial Council. And the Judicial Council basically sets policy for the state court system. And back early on in the pandemic, the Judicial Council ruled that all eviction cases should be paused for the time being, because it would be contrary to the public health to be forcing tenants to show up to crowded courtrooms in order to kind of have to defend their housing in person through an in-person court hearing. So the Judicial Council said no eviction cases in person for the time being. And so that kind of knocks out steps 2, 3, and 4. And you'll see that when it comes to step 5, I've sort of put a dashed line through this. There are 2 things that are kind of impacting whether or not sheriffs will carry out physical evictions right now. One is an executive order that was initiated by Governor Newsom a couple months ago. And that was supposed to put a pause on sheriffs doing physical evictions. However, there are some holes in that executive order. So it's imperfect. And the other is that it seems to be that it's much more kind of county by county that sheriffs are deciding whether or not to carry these out. And I did check with a tenant attorney yesterday, and the sheriff departments in Alameda and Contra Costa counties are not carrying out physical evictions, or are not supposed to be carrying out physical evictions right now. So the key thing is that these protections are going to change over time. The timelines are constantly changing. For instance, the Judicial Council actually came very close to reopening eviction courts last week. But thankfully, after kind of a mass mobilization on the part of tenants groups up and down the state, the Judicial Council was convinced to hold off and to allow these protections to remain in place, and to give the governor and the state legislature more time to develop long-lasting tenant protections. So I think my advice to you is to, to try to stay current, to check back in with me and check in with our online resources, which I'm about to share with you frequently, since we'll be keeping those things update. And to check in with tenant counselors and attorneys, as often as you feel like you need to, if you're in a tough situation, or if you feel confused and have a legal question. So next slide, please. Where can I find more information? So EBHO has been tracking all of these different policies, and we have been trying to keep them as up to date as possible on our website. And this link will be shared with you I think in the resources that go out after this call. And you can go there in order to find more detailed information about the policies that impact your particular city or county. EBHO also has a bunch of legal services that are listed on its website. So if you do need to look for a tenant attorney or a tenant counselor, then you, then you can go to that link in order to find information. And of course, please be in touch. I do also want to stress that, some of the tenant counseling that's available is low cost or even no cost. So hopefully finances shouldn't be a barrier to accessing this knowledge and accessing these services. And I think that's especially true in Alameda County, which tends to have more tenant legal service resources than Contra Costa, unfortunately. Okay, so at this point, I want to pause, and I'd be happy to take any questions that have come in so far.
Can people raise their hand with the raise a hand button if they have a question? And if you're on the phone, you can unmute using *6. No questions?
There will be more opportunities. So I'll go into the section on Contra Costa now, and we'll pause again for questions after that.
I have a question. Thank you, Alex, for presenting this eviction moratorium. So I work in Alameda County, and I wanted to know, how long is this eviction moratorium supposed to happen? Is it through end of June, through July?
In Alameda County?
Yes.
So the moratorium in Alameda County is currently set to expire on July 28th.
Okay.
And that can be extended.
Okay.
And so tenant advocates are very likely going to call upon the Board of Supervisors to extend that expiration date before July 28th, especially if cases in Alameda County are still on the rise, if there are still a lot of restrictions on people's ability to work, and if we think that it's really critically important for public health. My best guess is that this pandemic is going to be with us for a long time, so that's probably still going to be an issue on July 28th. But as of right now, it's set to expire on July 28th.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Anything else right now? Okay, let's go into Contra Costa. Kiki, can you go to the next slide, please? Should say, how does a local eviction moratorium work? Yeah, so a little bit more information on the local policies in particular. So these are the policies that have been passed by city and county governments. And unfortunately, there are really large variations from policy to policy, depending on kind of where you live. So I want to break it down and talk about some of the key provisions that, that you're likely to see in every single policy, regardless of where you live, and kind of talk about them at a general level so that we can all kind of build our knowledge about, in general, how do these policies work, so that then we can talk about the specifics that are particular to certain cities and counties later, and have those details make a little bit more sense. So the first key issue that every moratorium will address is something that I'm calling the moratorium period. And that's actually the thing that I was just talking about with Don. And so there's three kind of main things that define the moratorium period. There's a start date, there's an end date, and then there's a list of what type of evictions are banned during that moratorium period. So it'll say, you know, starting at this time and until this time, a tenant cannot be evicted for these type of reasons. And in terms of the COVID eviction moratoria, all of them at bare minimum say that a tenant cannot be evicted for the inability to pay their rent right now. But again, this is a matter of protecting individual and public health. So really any eviction right now is a dangerous one. Therefore, a lot of policies go further than what we call non-payment evictions to ban what we call no-fault evictions. And those can be things like, you know, the landlord evicting a tenant so that they can make major repairs or capital improvements to the apartment, or an owner evicting a tenant because they or a family member wants to move in and occupy the unit. So in a lot of places, those types of evictions are not allowed right now as well. There are, however, almost always some exceptions. So there are some evictions that are allowed to happen. And in our area in the East Bay, the ones that are allowed tend to revolve around two things. One is in order to comply with some existing state law, because state law kind of overrules local law. And the other thing is that if the eviction is necessary in order to protect public health and safety. That's a little bit vague what that means. That's often something that a court will have to decide, but most of these policies do have an exemption for evictions that are meant to protect public health or safety. There are also sometimes exceptions for certain types of units, because there are laws that kind of limit what types of units can be regulated when it comes to eviction protections and rent controls. So hopefully we can get into some of those details. And again, I literally didn't write the law, so I apologize that, you know, that there can be so many points of confusion around each of these things. I do want to make a note here and say that once the moratorium period ends, you as a tenant are obligated to start making your monthly rent payments again. So if the moratorium period ends and you don't pay your rent the next time that it's due, you actually will be able to be evicted for non-payment at that time. So let's hold that in our minds. Second, earlier we talked about how a rent increase could lead to an indirect form of eviction. So some, but not all jurisdictions have implemented a rent freeze. And I want to be really clear, this means a limit on rent increases. It doesn't mean a limit on rent payments. It doesn't forgive tenants of the obligation to pay their rent. It just means that in some places, property owners won't be able to increase the rents in ways that might lead indirectly to evictions. Again, there are some caveats here. These rent freezes usually apply to some, but not all units, because state law, basically complicates things and makes it so that you can't always implement rent controls on all types of units. Okay. Oop. The next issue is something called the grace period. So why do we need a grace period? Well, the reason is that, let's say you have an eviction moratorium and it lasts for 3 months. And at the end of that period, tenants are obligated to start paying their rent again. But we understand that we're in a recession right now, and a lot of jobs have been lost. A huge number of jobs have been lost. And a lot of economists believe that those are not going to come back, at least not come back quickly. So if after the moratorium period, people are not only expected to pay their rent, but also pay back all of the rent that they missed during the moratorium, at a time in which they may still be out of work, they may still be battling the disease, they may still be taking care of loved ones, then folks are just not going to be able to pay it, especially low to moderate income people. So most policies have a grace period, which says that while you now have to start paying your regular rent again, you have a certain amount of time to pay the debt. That is, pay the rent that you missed before you can be evicted. So that should it's meant to give people some time to kind of get back up on their feet after the moratorium period ends. And I want to highlight for you a couple aspects of how the grace period works. The first is the length. So how long is it? Is it for 90 days? Is it for 180 days, etc.? The second is that some, but not all policies have benchmarks built in, which say basically, I think like in the city of, I believe in Fremont, for instance, tenants are given 180 days to pay back any rent that they missed during the moratorium, but they have to pay back 50% of that debt within the first 90 days. So sometimes policies lay out these benchmarks where you have to kind of hit these milestones with your kind of repayment, but a lot of them don't have those benchmarks. So I want to be clear about that. Most policies also prohibit late fees for the rent that tenants were unable to pay due to the pandemic. And then there's one really big question, which is, so what happens after the grace period ends? What happens if that 180 days goes by and the tenant has been able to pay back some of their debt, but not all of it? Well, in most policies, at that time, then the tenant will be allowed to be evicted. However, there are some policies, in particular in Alameda County, that say that at that point in time, the tenant cannot be evicted, even if they have not been able to fully pay off their debt. Instead, what happens in those cases is that that debt, that rental debt, becomes what is called a consumer debt. And again, it's not forgiven. You still owe it to the landlord, and the landlord can still pursue it. However, the landlord's means of pursuing that debt is, for instance, taking the tenant to small claims court in order to try to get a judgment against them saying you must pay this money, to your landlord. So again, the debt isn't forgiven in places like Alameda County. However, the landlord cannot use eviction as a means of kind of penalizing the tenant for not being able to pay that debt by the end of the grace period. And finally, this is a little bit more kind of in the weeds, but these policies all lay out some notification requirements. Some of the protections, for instance, the protections that are in operation during the moratorium period that we're in right now tend to just apply to people, blanket, like all tenants. But some of the protections do require that you provide notification and documentation of need to your landlord. And so these policies will kind of lay out a timeline in which you need to tell your landlord, hey, I'm not able to pay my rent this month. Here's why. I've lost my job. I have a huge medical bill because I was battling COVID, etc. And then they also tend to lay out what sort of documentation you need to provide, if you do need to provide documentation, in order to be able to prove basically that your reason for being unable to pay was somehow linked to the coronavirus. And I want to be really clear that I think honestly, the best practice is that if you're in this boat, to just collect and hold on to that documentation so that worst case scenario, you have proof to be able to show that you had a loss of income and that you deserve these tenant protections. Okay, next slide, please. So there are a number of cities and counties in our region that have passed their own local eviction moratoriums. Both Contra Costa County and Alameda County, have passed county-wide policies. And you can see here a list of all of the cities in each of those counties that have also passed their own policies. So the county policies actually extend to the whole territory of the county. That means that they extend to all cities, whether or not those cities have their own local ordinances, and to unincorporated areas. This means that communities that don't have their own ordinances, like Walnut Creek, Piedmont, Dublin, or unincorporated areas, are all covered by some form of local eviction moratorium. They're covered by the county ordinance. The situation gets a little bit more complicated in ways that we will discuss in cities that have passed their own ordinances, because that means that there's kind of two policies that are in effect, and oftentimes it's on us to kind of sort out, well, which protections apply. Next slide, please. So let's talk about that right now. Does the city or the county ordinance apply if I live in a city that does have a city ordinance? And I wish it were easier, but the fact is that this question of city or versus county ordinance differs slightly whether you're in Contra Costa County or in Alameda County. So here's the way it works in Contra Costa County. If you live in a city that has an ordinance that deals with a specific issue, then you're covered by the city law when it comes to that issue. However, if there's an issue in the county law that your city doesn't address, then you're covered by the county law on that issue. It's very frustrating, but let me try to give you a concrete example of how that plays out from the standpoint of, say, a renter who lives in El Cerrito. So here we're looking at some of those key aspects of the policies, which I was just going through, and kind of looking at how they stack up side by side in the county ordinance versus the city ordinance. So when it comes to a prohibition on evictions for non-payment of rent, both the county and the city ban evictions for non-payment. So that means that in Contra Costa, the city ordinance prevails because it regulates that particular issue. What about no-fault evictions? Well, the county ordinance bans no-fault evictions, but El Cerrito's ordinance doesn't ban no-fault evictions. So therefore, if you live in El Cerrito, you're protected by the county ordinance on this issue because your city didn't address it. Same is true with rent increases. The county bans rent increases, but the city doesn't. So if you live in El Cerrito, you're covered by the county ban on rent increases. When it comes to late fees, both of them ban late fees, so you're covered by the city ordinance. And when it comes to the time period for the grace period, you can see that the county ordinance calls for 120 days to pay back rent, but the city ordinance pays for 180 days to pay back rent. Given that the city has regulated on the issue of the grace period, the city law is in effect, and that means that for renters in El Cerrito, they have a longer period of time to repay their debt. Okay, let's quickly do the same thing, thinking about it from the perspective of Alameda County. So the same is essentially true in Alameda County, except it's a little bit stronger in favor of tenants. And the way in which it's stronger is that in order for local law to apply on a particular issue, then that city actually has to prove to the county that it offers stronger protections for tenants on that issue. So let's run through this again from the standpoint of Alameda County and the city of Alameda. Both of them ban evictions for non-payment of rent. So the county ordinance is the default one that's in charge here. Both of them ban no-fault evictions. Again, the county ordinance is in place here. When it comes to rent increases, Alameda County did not ban rent increases, but the city of Alameda did on many units. So in this case, assuming that the city of Alameda kind of applies to the county and says, hey, we have protections when it comes to rent increases. Therefore, we want our law to apply on that issue. Then in that case, renters in Alameda County will be covered by the city's law banning rent increases. When it comes to late fees and the length of the grace period, however, the county's ordinance is either equal to or stronger than the city of Alameda's ordinance. So therefore, you would be protected by the county ordinance. So the rule of thumb in Alameda County is that as a renter, you will be covered by the strongest, basically the strongest provisions that are on the books. And that's true in almost all circumstances in Contra Costa County. However, it's just a little bit less dry in Contra Costa. And there may be some circumstances in which it's actually not true that you're eligible for the stronger of the two. So this is a place in which I have to say, you know, it's very easy to get in over one's head. I feel honestly pretty much over my head. So this would be a really great place to consult a lawyer or a tenant attorney if you're really concerned about your rights. Next slide, please. So how does the ordinance in Contra Costa County work? Okay, so when it comes to the moratorium period, the ordinance bans evictions for non-payment of rent and no fault reasons from March 16th until July 15th. I have a star here next to where it says no fault reasons. And the reason that I put that there is that Contra Costa passed an exemption, or excuse me, they included an exception for one particular type of no fault reason. And it's one of the ones that I referred to earlier. And that is that if the owner or a member of the owner's family wants to move into that unit, then they can evict their tenant, even during the moratorium period. So there is that exception in Contra Costa. Contra Costa County also banned rent increases during the moratorium period. However, again, there are exceptions, mostly in order to comply with state law. And that includes exceptions for new buildings, which means buildings built since 2005, affordable housing, owner-occupied duplexes, and single-family homes or condos, unless those single-family homes or condos are owned by corporations, in which case the rent fees should apply. In terms of the grace period, Contra Costa passed says that renters have 120 days from the end of the moratorium period to pay back any rent that they might have missed without late fees before eviction is permitted. So the key thing to note here is that you have 120 days, and if you're not able to fully pay back any rent that you missed at that point in time, then you can be evicted. What this means is that if you're a resident of Contra Costa County and the county ordinance is the one, is the only protection that you have, then under almost all circumstances, you should not be able to be evicted until 120 days after the moratorium expires. So that would be 120 days from July 15th. And honestly, I'm not good enough at math to figure out exactly what month that's in right now, but that's just something that I want you to know. And another key thing I want you to know is that there is a notification requirement. In order to qualify for these protections, you need to provide your landlord with a written notice of your inability to pay within 14 days of missing a rent payment. The county ordinance doesn't actually lay out anything specific about needing to provide documentation to back that up, like doctor's bills, et cetera. But I would say it's a very good idea to collect documentation anyhow, just in case. Next slide, please. So I've done my best in order to try to figure out whether the city, the county, or some combination of the two, sorry, I should say, whether the ordinance from the city, the county, or some combination of the two applies to you depending on where you live in Contra Costa County. Next slide, please. So what if I need help paying my rent? It's a really, really good question. We think that, in order to, having a grace period is really important, but it's still going to be really hard for a lot of low income renters in particular, or folks who are out of work, to be able to repay their full rental debt within the grace period window. So one of the things that can help kind of fill that gap is something called rental assistance. And in Contra Costa County, there are two nonprofit organizations. Oh, I have a bit of a typo here. Sorry, I'll try to correct that. Shelter Inc. and Catholic Charities, these nonprofit organizations, are providing rental assistance for residents of Contra Costa County. And you can learn more about rental assistance resources by going to this part of EBHO's website. I provided the link here. I should say, in most cases, your eligibility for rental assistance may depend on where you live and what your income is, because these funds are usually targeted to people who are lower income and therefore are more at risk of homelessness should they lose shelter. Next slide, please. So how can I take action to strengthen tenant protections if I'm a resident of Contra Costa County? Well, one thing you can do is you can use this link, which we provided here, to send an email to your supervisor, basically calling on them to divest from the sheriff's department and from the county jail system, and instead to invest in housing for unsheltered people, to invest in more affordable housing, and invest in rental assistance for those people in need. And EBHO is really, really proud to stand here with the Movement for Black Lives and lots of other Black-led liberation organizations, both locally and nationally, that are basically calling upon us to remedy, decades, if not centuries, of anti-Black racism, racial injustice, racial inequality, by taking some of the money away from policing and incarceration, which absorbs an excessive amount of our public budgets, and instead investing that money in resources that are needed for Black housing, health, and healing, and really the health and welfare of all communities of color. So you can find a sample email that we've been using to email supervisors to call upon them to divest and invest in this way. There are two other ways in which you can tell your story as a renter and to testify at a virtual meeting as well. One of them is to testify at the Board of Supervisors meeting, where we will be calling upon the supervisors to extend the moratorium as well as the grace period in order to make it more forgiving for tenants. And I think that meeting is going to be on July 14th. It hasn't been declared for certain yet, so this is tentative. And of course, you can stay connected with me. You can reach out to me if you want to be kept up to date on when that meeting will be, so that you can share your story and call upon the Board of Supervisors to strengthen tenant protections. And if you live in Concord, then the same thing is going to be happening at a Concord City Council meeting, where they'll be discussing the end date for the moratorium and the length of the grace period, and that's on July 7th. Okay, so again, I want to pause here for questions, especially related to Contra Costa County, but also anything that's coming up for folks so far.
Alex, there was one question that was posed, and it was, what if the El Cerrito grace period is 90 days, for example? Right. Then does the Contra Costa County grace period prevail?
Right, that is a really good question. And that is a kind of concern of mine, and I have been asking and have not gotten a definitive legal answer, let's say, from the county yet. Because I think what that person is pointing to is that if the law in Contra Costa says that as long as a city addresses that issue, then the city ordinance is the one that prevails. That could be a problem if your city actually has weaker protections when it comes, for instance, to the length of the grace period than the county. The good news for most renters in Contra Costa County who live in cities that do have their own moratoria is that their moratoria provide longer grace periods. I do think that there's only one city in Contra Costa with its own, only one city, which is the city of Pinole, that has its own ordinance, and where the ordinance only allows 90 days rather than 120 days to pay back that rent. So if you live in Pinole, let's get to the bottom of this, but I think that other than that, tenants will have 120 days in Contra Costa at the very least. And if they live in Pittsburgh, San Pablo, Richmond, etc., you will have longer than that.
There's a question from Chili H. How do we access all these links after Zoom is closed? I'm going to send a follow-up email to everyone who is registered, and it'll have all of these links and more for you to access.
Hi, I'm Kateria. I had a clarifying question about grace period and moratorium. If the moratorium ends on July 28th, that means that renters have to pay their rent on August 28th for that month, or they could risk eviction. But they have 12 months in Alameda County, I guess, or whatever the grace period is, to pay the back rent. Am I summarizing that correctly? Because I'm trying to differentiate between the grace period and then when rent is ongoing required.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so if the Alameda County ordinance expires, if the moratorium in Alameda County expires on July 28th, then yes, you as a tenant will be obligated to pay your regular rent on August 1st, assuming that that's when you normally pay your rent, in August basically. And if you don't pay your regular rent at that time, then you could be evicted for non-payment of rent. The question is what happens with all of the debt that you were unable to pay, say, for April, May, June, and potentially July. And the way that the Alameda County ordinance works, or the way that any grace period works, is it says that you have that amount of time to pay the back rent, as you were just mentioning, before that can become grounds for eviction. But in the meantime, you do need to be paying your regular rent, because if you don't pay that, then that can become grounds for eviction. So I hope that that kind of confirms that what you were saying, which I think you do have the correct understanding.
Okay, that makes total sense. Only follow-up is, if the moratorium ends on July 28th, you're not paying for the month of July, but you would pay your rent whenever rent is due in August.
Exactly.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Of course, if you can pay your rent in July, then you might pay your rent, or you may pay 50% of your rent, or as much as you can, But yes, if you're in the position of like really being unable to pay, then you would probably not pay your rent in July, but would need to pay in August or else risk eviction.
Alex, I have a question. In most likelihood, the probability of people being able to pay the back rent for however long the grace period is going to be very, very difficult.
Yes.
I mean, what are the resources that are available? I mean, you mentioned a couple of nonprofits that can offer assistance in the. I mean, is that realistic in terms of meeting those demands?
It's not realistic in terms of meeting the need for everybody. So yes, there are some nonprofit resources. When we go into the section on Alameda County, I will be talking about some of the resources that are specific to different cities in Alameda County. But if I'm being completely honest, there are some cities that, put together a pool for rental assistance, maybe $2 million, $3 million, and they ran out of money within days. So we know that the scale of the need is really, really immense. And I think that's one of the reasons why we as an organization have thought that it's important to advocate for policies like the one which we will discuss in a second in Alameda County, which again, while not forgiving the debt, means that people can't be evicted for not being able to pay their back rent in the future. It's no fun to live with debt. It is really problematic to live with debt. At the same time, it's even worse to be saddled with debt and to lose your housing in the midst of a pandemic. So we think that the most basic stopgap is to make sure that people can't be evicted over the debt while they get their lives back together, while We continue to advocate for state and federal government to put more money into assisting renters, assisting small property owners, in order to basically clear that debt. So that's one thing to say, is that those very strong eviction protections are needed, we think, in order to protect tenants from the worst consequences of what happens if you can't pay that back rent. That said, we really need state government and federal government, who have a lot more money than local government, to put a massive amount of assistance for tenants into the housing system in order to deal with the issue that you're raising. And I will say that the Democrats in the House of Representatives, as you might have heard, passed a very, very large bill called the HEROES Act last month. And the HEROES Act calls for the federal government to spend $100 billion to help renters who are underwater right now, renters who are accruing debt and can't pay their rent. There's a lot of resistance from Republicans in the Senate and of course, Donald Trump. But it's something that we as an organization are advocating for, that many, many organizations are advocating for. And we really think that we do need a renters bailout at that scale in order to address this issue. And when I say a renters bailout, I want to be clear that that money is not just going to go into the pocket of renters for them to go do whatever with. It's going to be money that then helps them pay their debt to their landlords. So providing relief to renters is also providing relief to the property owners.
Alex, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I had a question. So after the grace period or the moratorium, does the landlord have to start the eviction process over again?
That's a really good question. And by the way, Willie, it's good to see you. It's been many months.
Yeah, thank you.
I think if I'm being honest, I don't 100% know the answer to that question. So I think it's a really good one. I'll tell you what I do know, Willie, which is that many people had evictions that were not related to COVID that were already pending when the pandemic started. Meaning, maybe you didn't pay your rent in February of 2020, and the landlord tried to evict you for that, and you were still kind of, maybe your case was in court, and then all of a sudden COVID hit, and the moratoriums were created. My understanding is that the moratoriums mean that even if your eviction case was pre-COVID, didn't have anything to do with COVID, you still can't be evicted right now because it would be so detrimental to individual and public health to lose shelter in the midst of this pandemic. So that much I do know. What I don't know for certain is whether once the moratorium ends, whether that will be able to pick up right where it was, or whether the landlord will actually have to start the process over.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question, if I may. So I'm struck with the fact that often the tenant feels very powerless because of their lack of information about all of this. And I'm wondering if if you've seen any forms that you can use to talk to your landlord about needing this or anything like that, because I think oftentimes the fear of confronting that or saying you don't have the ability to pay right now stops people from ever talking about it, and that gets you into more problems down the road. So I'm wondering if there's forms out there or a template or something like that.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point and an excellent question. And many organizations have put together those forms, and some city governments and county agencies have put together those forms too. So for instance, I said, you're required to notify your landlord of your inability to pay. And so a lot of housing agencies at the city or county level have created template forms that tenants can use in order to meet the requirements of the ordinance and just communicate this to their landlords. So I think it kind of depends on where you live, but if you go online and look for the housing agency in the city or county where you live, then you should be able to find a form like that. There are also some tenant organizations groups that do like tenants' rights and legal defense that have been creating forms of their own, because what you're saying is absolutely true.
I'll try to find one and put it in the chat and the resources.
Thank you so much.
There's a question from Kateri who has their hand raised. Go ahead.
Oh my
Kateri.
God, I didn't unraise my hand. Question already answered. I'll fix that.
Okay.
It happens.
Then there's another question, which is, can you restate how the debt from non-payment can be used for a UD?
How the debt for non-payment can be used. Yeah, sure. Basically, let's taking again the concrete example of the Contra Costa policy. The policy says that if you have unpaid debt at the end, if you have unpaid debt 120 days after the moratorium expires, then your landlord can file an unlawful detainer case against you, and that case is legitimate. If they file a case against you before that time, then the law is written in such a way as to basically say that that unlawful detainer is illegitimate. It is null and void. But after that 120-day grace period, then yes, unless there is further action protecting tenants, perhaps at the state level, and that's something that we'll talk about at the very end of this webinar, then at that point, your landlord would be able to file an unlawful detainer against you for unpaid debt. Thanks for these awesome questions. Let's jump back in and talk specifics about Alameda County, and then we'll have one more round of Q&A before we wrap up today. So Kiki, can we go back to the slides, please? Awesome. And next slide. Great. Thank you. Okay. So again, I want to apologize for the fact that what I'm about to share is a little bit confusing, and there's a specific reason for that, which is that Alameda County Board of Supervisors is still in the process of formalizing their ordinance. So everything that I'm going to share with you is the best information that I have, and I think that this is very likely to reflect the actual policy that they will pass, but it won't be for sure until they take a vote on it this coming Tuesday. And I'm going to talk to you about how you can potentially get involved this coming Tuesday in order to make sure that they do formalize this policy. Okay. So the way that it's written right now is that Alameda County bans evictions for both non-payment of rent and no-fault reasons from April 21st to July 28th. And I've put a star here because we and other advocacy organizations are going to be calling upon the county to make that start date earlier before they formalize the ordinance. The reason being, shelter in place began in mid-March. The economy was already ground to a halt by the time people were asked to pay rent on April 1st. So to be effective, this moratorium really needs to begin in March. So hopefully it will start in March, but just where things are at right now, it's written as April 21st. The Alameda County ordinance does not ban rent increases. When it comes to the grace period, it basically gives you 12 months from the time that payment was missed in order to pay back rent with no late fees. And then at that point in time, any remaining or outstanding debt is turned into a consumer debt, as we discussed earlier. But eviction is not permitted if your inability to pay back that debt is due to COVID-19. So I want to just pause here for a second because this is very technical. I want to break it down a little further. First thing is the way that this 12-month time period works. It is not 12 months from July 28th. It is not 12 months from the end of the moratorium period. It is 12 months from when you missed that full payment. So if you were unable to pay rent in June 1st, 2020, then you have 12 months, you have until June 1st, 2021 to pay the rent that you missed in June of 2020. And that's true for every month in which you may have not been able to make full payment. So the timeline for repayment will change depending on the specific month in which you were unable to make full payment. And just again, I want to be clear that Alameda County is one of the few places in the state right now where if at the end of that grace period you still have outstanding debt, you can't be evicted at that point in time. So what are the notification requirements? Well, in order to be eligible for these protections, then you're supposed to you're supposed to actually provide documentation of your inability to pay to your landlord within 45 days of a request from the landlord, or 30 days from the end of the state of emergency, whichever is later. And this is written in like a very typical bureaucratic kind of way, and it's very confusing. It's very confusing in particular because most renters don't know technically when the state of emergency began or ended. So the advice that I would give to you and that I recommend that you share with your folks or people who you work with is that you should really try to just provide this documentation as early as you can. And you should try to document the fact that you sent it. So that might be doing something like certified mail, saved text messages, taking photos of email exchanges, or just whatever. Just, you know, worst case scenario, your landlord still tries to take you to court when they don't have the right to, and you want to be able to show that you followed the notification requirements. One other thing to say about notification is that the county ordinance lists several different types of documentation that can be used to prove financial hardship due to COVID. And that includes things like, you know, a letter of termination from your employer, medical bills related to receiving treatment, things like that. However, the county says that if you're unable to provide that documentation for whatever reason, then you can basically provide a sworn statement, meaning that you've kind of like, you're basically pledging to your landlord that you were unable to pay due to COVID and that you were unable to provide documentation also because the world is sort of upside down right now, and that you sign that, and that should be good enough in order to meet this notification requirement. Next slide, please. So which ordinance applies to me? Same thing as with Contra Costa County. I wanted to lay out, you know, if you're if you live in one of the places in the leftmost column, then you are covered by the county ordinance and only the county ordinance. If you live in somewhere in the middle column, then you are likely to be covered by some sort of combination of city and county ordinance, getting the benefit of the strongest provisions from each one of those ordinances. And I left the city column here kind of to be determined. There's two reasons for that. One is that Alameda County's ordinance is strong enough that it is stronger than most of the city ordinances in the county, with the exception of Berkeley and Oakland. Berkeley and Oakland also pass very strong eviction moratoriums. So it may be the case that that the cities of Oakland and Berkeley will apply to the county to basically opt out of the county ordinance and say, you know, we think ours offer the strongest protection for tenants. Here's why. Therefore, the city ordinances will apply. But that will, you know, there's a whole bunch of things to be determined there. So I'm kind of leaving that as TBD for the time being. Next slide, please. What if I need help paying my rent? So again, Catholic Charities provides rental assistance for residents of Alameda County, and the cities of Berkeley, Emeryville, Fremont, Hayward, and Oakland have all set up payment assistance programs that are specific to typically low-income residents of those places. I saw briefly in the chat earlier that someone might have shared another resource or other resources, and I appreciate that. And if you can make sure if we can capture that, or if you can email it to me, then I'll make sure that our resources page is most up to date to reflect all of the payment assistance programs that are out there.
Well, Alex, those suggestions are included in our general resource guide, which is the link that I put under direct support.
Thank you.
Just so
Great.
Yeah.
Super helpful. Okay, next slide, please. So again, if I live in Alameda County, how can I take action to strengthen tenant protections? So the same thing, EBHO's call to divest from policing and prisons, invest in housing and healing. You see here the link to the form that is specific to Alameda County, which will help you send an email calling upon your supervisor to divest and reinvest. And the next thing is to tell your story and to call upon the Board of Supervisors to uphold strong tenant protections on this coming Tuesday, June 23rd. So basically, all of the details which I just gave you about the Alameda County Ordinance are, they're like at the finish line. Basically, the supervisors need to debate and vote on the policy twice in order for it to become law. They already did it once. So we're at the finish line and we need them to do it once more on June 23rd in order for the information that I share with you to become official. At the last vote, 3 of the supervisors voted in favor of the tenant protections, and 2 of them chose not to vote against it, but just to abstain from voting, period, because they were not really as much on board when it comes to these strong tenant protections. And they wanted to basically weaken them in ways that we think would harm tenants. The 2 who abstained from voting were Nate Miley and Scott Haggerty. So we think that, you know, when it comes to advocating and calling upon supervisors to uphold strong tenant protections, that we need to focus on those 2 folks in particular. They represent deep East Oakland and areas of East County, kind of over the hills, like in the Tri-Valley area, in Pleasanton, Livermore, that kind of area, et cetera. So if you live in their district, or if you have connections to Nate Miley or Scott Haggerty, then it's particularly important to weigh in with them by calling or writing on this coming Monday. And if you're interested in making a public comment at the meeting on Tuesday and would like some support, or would like to kind of coordinate with me so we can kind of show up as like EBHO's squad, then please reach out to me at alex@ebho.org so that we can coordinate ahead of time and that you can have all the support and resources that you need in order to make a really powerful testimony. We're almost coming to the end. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that there is an opportunity to also strengthen some of these protections at the state level. Assemblymember David Chu from San Francisco introduced a bill last week that is called AB or Assembly Bill 1436. And the way that AB 1436 would work is that it would take the model of the Alameda County Ordinance, or some of the basic provisions that are in the Alameda County Ordinance right now, and it would apply them statewide. Specifically, it would say that for tenants who are unable to pay their rent due to COVID, or rather I should say, it would basically protect tenants who are unable to pay their rent due to COVID from being evicted at any point in the future for having unpaid rental debt. So again, it wouldn't forgive you of that debt. It would just make sure that you couldn't be evicted for it. You couldn't lose your home because of it at any point in the future. So, you know, again, right now, this is a protection that renters in Alameda County and Oakland and Berkeley have because of actions by our local legislators. But for the vast majority of renters in California, they don't have these protections. And AB 1436 would kind of scale that up to create a more protective umbrella and more uniformity for tenants all across the state. ACE, or Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment, has created kind of an online petition sort of thing in order to call upon members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, where this bill is now being heard, to get them to pass this law. So if you're interested in amplifying that call, then you can use the link that's been provided here. Please consider sharing it with other, other impacted tenants and other folks who you think would be positively impacted by this law. I'm going to pause here again for questions before we wrap up.
There was a chat in the chat box, but then Zoom kicked me off and back on, so I can't see it. Whoever texted that, would you unmute yourself and restate it, please?
I see a question from Dawn about, will this affect someone's credit with the consumer debt? Will there be an eviction on their record? That's a really great question. Yes, so if someone is evicted, it does go on their record and it has very damaging implications for trying to secure housing in the future, which is one of the reasons that eviction is a primary cause of homelessness, especially for people who already experience discrimination in the housing market, especially Black and Latino women. This is what research has shown. So yeah, eviction is very problematic from the standpoint of it ending up on your record. Now, if these moratoria work and they prevent people from being evicted, then that eviction will not show up on anyone's record. However, the consumer debt may show up on your, it will show up on your kind of your credit rating. And that can, of course, have harmful effects for people as well. One detail that I would share with you about AB 1436, so the bill that I was just talking about, one of the provisions in that bill is it says that it basically prohibits property owners from using a negative credit report against a tenant who is applying to live there if that negative credit rating happened because they were unable to pay debt due to COVID-19. So it's a very, sorry if that's complicated, but what I'm basically trying to say is that if that bill passes and you do end up with a negative credit rating because of the COVID-related debt, then this bill would say that when you go to apply for housing later on down the road, that your landlord would not be able to use that mark against you. And if they did, they would be in violation of state law.
Are there any other questions?
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Are there any cases where legal fees in eviction court cases could be used for an eviction? And I'm thinking specifically where a tenant has been able to cover all past due rent, but at the time that they're meeting one of the benchmarks, the only thing remaining would be court fees. Or in a situation where social services is able to come in and pay everything but court fees. Would court fees be, would a landlord still be able to use those court fees as a reason to evict the person?
In the scenario that you're envisioning, are you envisioning that these are court fees that
related? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that there were court fees that were kind of accrued prior to the coronavirus pandemic as a part of some ongoing negotiation between tenant and landlord, or that they would be court fees. You're talking about court fees that the tenant would be obligated to pay on behalf of the landlord?
Right. I'm guessing from what you've said so far that those court fees would not apply during COVID, but if it were a case like the possibility you described where the case, an eviction case started in February, for example, could that tenant's inability to pay the court fees, so they've paid everything else or have the means to pay everything else, would those court fees still be a reason for a landlord to be able to evict the person?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't personally know the answer to that. Okay. When it comes to court fees that the tenant owed the landlord due to something that happened before COVID, I just don't know the answer to that. I do know that some of the moratoriums that have been passed have included things that say that, that basically as an enforcement measure, that if the landlord brings an eviction against their tenant, it goes to court, the court finds, hey, this eviction was not allowed because of that eviction moratorium, then the landlord actually has to pay the tenant's court fees. So I don't, so some of these moratoriums basically do have something about like who owes what if the case goes to court. But I can definitely see that there could be situations where there were court fees that were owed prior to COVID, and I just personally don't know whether that could be evictable. I'm sorry to say.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Do we have other questions?
Okay, great. We have a contribution from Sherry about some more information about court fees. Thank you, Sherry.
Can you say what Sherry's comment is? Because
oh yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
Access to
Sherry
comments.
Gibson wrote, generally the court fees are spelled out in the rental lease. So that would be another place to look for guidance on what the obligations of the tenant might be. I see that Dorcas wrote that I thought Emeryville and Hayward stopped taking applications because the demand was too high. I think that's right. That's what I was referring to earlier. I don't know off the top of my head which cities ran through their rental assistance funds, have already run through their rental assistance money, but yeah, it may well be Emeryville and Hayward. I do know that's been a problem in Alameda County. And again, that's why we want to see a much more large scale infusion of money for rental assistance from the state and federal governments. Okay, well, I'm hearing no more questions at the moment. Kiki, if you wouldn't mind going back to screen sharing for just a moment. Thank you. Just have like 2 more slides. Next slide, please. So how can I take action to defend Black communities? There are a myriad of ways, and it is not my position to tell you what all of them are. But I did want to uplift at least one thing, which is that the Movement for Black Lives is holding a very large march in Washington, D.C. today, and have called upon communities to act in solidarity with their call to, again, kind of divest from the criminal justice system and invest in resources for Black communities, kind of in solidarity with the movement and in honor of Juneteenth. And you can use this link right here to go to a map which will show you all of the events that have been planned in the Bay Area and really all over the country in solidarity with this call. I can say from having looked at it pretty recently that there are several protests, celebrations, and vigils that are scheduled for the East Bay this afternoon, this evening, and tomorrow. And there are also virtual events for local residents if you want to connect, if you want to learn, if you want to show up, but don't feel either safe or able to kind of be in a mass gathering type setting right now. Next slide, please, and last slide. Thank you all so much for your time, for your attention, for your questions. Again, it's been an honor to be able to share some of this information with you, and I can't stress enough that I'm here to work with you. I'm here to help answer questions. I'm here to be in the mystery if that's the best that we can do. And you're welcome to reach out to me at alex@ebho.org at any time. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm happy to hang out here also if people have any last smattering of questions or anything they want to discuss.
I wanted to ask Alex, as everyone's hopping off, but also it sounds like the encouragement is for everyone to please, reach out to their local cities and counties to get informed, to stay informed as things continue to develop. Mm-hmm. In addition to staying informed with EBHO, because things are moving very quickly. There can be some places of misinformation or confusion, and so it's continuing this conversation, but being proactive and staying informed with their local city and county so that they can stay in the know as it moves.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a great point. I'll say that in my observation, some cities and some counties have been more proactive about communicating with tenants than others have. Some have really not done enough, to be quite honest. You know, the way that I did the research, which I then shared with you all today, was honestly to like go through with like every city and just Google like El Cerrito eviction moratorium. And what I found is that if you do that, within the first couple of hits, you will be able to find a page that your city or your county has created to share information about the policy. And in the best case scenario, it includes like a frequently asked questions document that can help kind of break down the details, or it'll include contact information for people who you can ask to follow up. It'll point you to other resources, whether it's tenant legal services or rental assistance. So to my knowledge, they're not, you know, doing things to like automatically update people, like for instance, by signing up for an email list where you'll get automatic updates if there's a change to the policy.
Right.
But if you do just kind of Google city eviction moratorium, you should be able to find pretty good information.
Thank you. Right.
All right. Thank you, everyone. You'll be getting a very detailed email after this is done with lots of links and information. Please stay connected.
And also, if you have resources, like Dawn is going to, I'm going to be emailing Dawn for some of the info. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you, Willie.
Thank you, Key.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
You're welcome. Look forward to hearing from you soon, Kiki.
Yes.
Thank you, Grover. Thank you, Alex, for everything and all
Yes,
EBHO
thank you.
staff. I miss you all.
Okay. Hello.
I'm a former alumni from the EBHO Leadership Academy, 2018. So I know a lot about EBHO.
Oh, nice.
And of course, EBALSI, you know, EBHO is one of our members with EBALSI. So yeah.
Yes.
Awesome.
We're no stranger.
Please don't be a stranger.
Not at all.
All right. Well, have a good rest of the day. Happy Juneteenth celebration.
Thank you, Dawn.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Grover, did you want us to stay on?
No, thanks everyone. There's still people in our room with us. Alex, I'll email you the chat text, which I just saved, and I'm just making sure that we're done here. Oh,
Alex, I had a quick question.